"I didn't buy you. Mercy, I saved you," said the cowboy who saw the fat woman's true worth. It was Arizona territory, June 1878, when the sun scorched the earth like burning coals, and every step across the dust carried the weight of secrets the land refused to bury. In the town of Dry Creek, where law was twisted by greed and women were traded like livestock, silence ruled the hearts of those too afraid to stand against cruelty. Yet on one fateful afternoon, the crowd gathered in the square, laughing and cheering as if pain were entertainment, unaware that destiny was about to walk through their lives wearing spurs and a shadowed hat. A cowboy, scarred by his past but stronger than his fears, watched with cold eyes as injustice unfolded before him. The air trembled with the sound of voices mocking a woman's worth. But beneath that humiliation, a story of courage and defiance was about to begin, one that no man, woman, or child in Dry Creek would ever forget. The heat pressed down heavy on Dry Creek as the townsfolk crowded tighter around the wooden stage, their boots grinding into the dust, their faces lit with cruel excitement, and their voices rising in a thunder of jeers and mockery, as if this gathering were nothing more than a twisted celebration. On the platform stood Clara, her wrists bound, her eyes lowered, her heart beating so loud she thought it might shatter through her chest. Yet the sound of laughter struck harder than any chain. The auctioneer, a thick man with a greedy grin, raised his hand high and barked out numbers, each bid echoing like a hammer against her soul, as men shouted offers not for love or companionship, but to claim her as if she were nothing more than cattle brought to market. The crowd laughed louder with every increase, cruel voices describing her body, mocking her size, stripping away dignity with words sharper than knives, and though she tried to keep her face still, every insult sank deeper, each laugh carving into her spirit, until she felt she might vanish under the weight of their scorn. She had dreamed once of love, of freedom, of a life where her voice mattered, but now in this place under the burning sun, she felt those dreams slipping away, traded for coins tossed like scraps at a gambler's table. Children sat on fences watching wide-eyed, women whispered behind gloved hands, and the town seemed to close in on her, the air suffocating, the sky itself pressing down as though the heavens wanted to turn away from the shame below. Clara felt her throat tighten, her lips trembling though no sound escaped, for she knew that showing pain would only feed the mob further, and so she stood still, each second dragging like an eternity, each laugh reminding her that in the eyes of Dry Creek she was nothing more than a cruel joke. The auctioneer slammed his fist on the post, demanding higher bids, and voices surged. Rough men throwing numbers, their greed fighting over her body as though she were a prize beast. The sun burned hotter, sweat rolled down her temple, and in the blur of faces she caught no kindness, only hunger, cruelty, and indifference, until the shame pressed so deep she thought she might collapse right there on the platform. She wanted to vanish into the dust, to let the earth swallow her so she would never hear another jeer, never see another pointing hand, never feel the sting of being treated less than human. But fate had bound her to that moment, and though her heart screamed for mercy, none came. Only the growing sound of money promised, voices chanting numbers, the cruel bark of the auctioneer, and the laughter of Dry Creek rising higher like thunder, rolling across the desert sky, sealing her humiliation in a spectacle the town would remember, not for her pain, but for their entertainment, never imagining that within those moments of cruelty, a storm was already moving closer, unseen but inevitable. Just as the auctioneer slammed his palm down demanding one final bid, the crowd's raucous laughter froze in their throats, for from the shadowed edge of the square, a lone figure began to move, his boots crunching slow against the brittle earth, his spurs striking like steel against silence, and the air itself seemed to shift, as if the desert wind carried a warning no one dared ignore. He was tall, lean, and marked by a scar that cut across his jaw. His hat tilted low to hide eyes that had seen too much, and though no one knew his story, the weight he carried was clear in the way men instinctively stepped aside as he approached the platform. The auctioneer sneered, barking that if the drifter wanted to bid, he'd best show gold like the others. But instead the cowboy removed his hat with deliberate calm, tossed it into the dust, and in a voice rough with years of silence but strong enough to cut through every jeer, he said words that struck the square like thunder. "I didn't buy you. Mercy, I saved you." For a heartbeat no one breathed, the world holding still as though the earth itself bent to listen, and Clara lifted her eyes, disbelieving, unsure if she had heard him right. But in his steady gaze she saw no mockery, no hunger, no greed, only recognition of the worth she thought long buried. Murmurs spread like brushfire, men shifting uneasily, women gasping, children staring wide-eyed as though a legend had stepped out of the dust to defy the cruelty they had accepted as law. The auctioneer sputtered, his face red with fury, demanding this stranger be dragged away, but no man moved, for the weight in Jesse Cole's stance told them plainly he was no man to challenge without paying dearly in blood. Clara's chest trembled with a hope she dared not believe, her lips parting though no words came, for in that single sentence he had done what no one else had in years. He had given her back the truth that she was not an object, not a joke, not a possession, but a person worth saving. A tension crackled through the air, sharp and dangerous, the silence heavier than any gun drawn, for everyone knew that such defiance in Dry Creek would not go unpunished, and yet the cowboy stood tall, his hand resting lightly near the worn handle of his revolver, his posture promising that if anyone dared challenge him, the desert would drink their blood before sundown. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not of weakness but of a fierce gratitude she could not speak, and in that moment the dusty square transformed. The laughter of men turned to nervous whispers, the voice of cruelty smothered by one man's stand. And though the law of Dry Creek favored the auctioneer, every soul watching knew that something greater had entered that place, something stronger than gold, stronger than shame, something that could not be bought or silenced. The auctioneer's face twisted with rage as his shouts shattered the silence, and within seconds armed men shoved through the crowd, rifles raised and pistols gleaming, their boots striking hard against the planks, as if violence itself answered his call. Yet Jesse did not flinch, his eyes locked on Clara, as he reached for her hand with a certainty that cut through her fear like a blade through rope, pulling her down from the stage in one swift motion, while the mob gasped in disbelief. Gunmen surged forward, but the cowboy's revolver was already drawn, the hammer cocked, the cold steel gleaming in the sun as his warning shot cracked through the air, scattering pigeons into the burning sky and freezing the men just long enough for him to lift Clara onto the back of his horse. She clutched the saddle horn with trembling hands, her breath breaking with terror and disbelief. Yet before her heart could steady, Jesse swung into the seat behind her, spurred his stallion, and the animal launched forward in a storm of hooves and dust, tearing through the square as chaos erupted behind them. Bullets exploded against barrels and posts, wood splintering, glass shattering, townsfolk diving for cover as shouts of fury filled the air. But the horse flew swift as the desert wind, mane whipping like fire, muscles straining with power as it carried them beyond the reach of the crowd. Clara pressed herself against Jesse, the roar of gunfire chasing them, the smell of smoke and powder stinging her senses, her pulse racing with a fear so sharp she thought it might rip her chest apart. Yet beneath it a strange strength rose, for even as death tried to close its grip, freedom's breath filled her lungs. Jesse guided the horse with steady hands, weaving through the canyon trail that cut away from town, every twist of the reins sharper than the bullets that whined past their ears, each turn of the path bought with raw courage. Clara dared one glance back and saw the riders spilling out of Dry Creek, dust clouds rising behind their horses as gun barrels glinted. The relentless pursuit, promising they would not let her go without a fight. Yet in the storm of her fear there was also wonder, for never before had she felt the wind tear through her hair. Never before had she been carried not as property, but as a person worth saving. The desert stretched endless before them, golden and merciless, the horizon shimmering like fire. But within that burning vastness lay hope, and Clara gripped the saddle tighter, her tears swept away by the rush of air as Jesse's voice cut through the thunder of hooves, calm and unyielding, telling her to hold on, to trust the ride, to believe that freedom, though chased by death, was stronger than fear. Night fell heavy over the desert as the stars scattered like silver dust across the endless black sky, and the crackle of a small campfire pushed back the chill that crept in with the dark, its light flickering against Clara's face as she sat wrapped in silence, her body weary from the ride, yet her spirit carrying a weight that no escape could easily shake. She stared into the flames, her eyes wet, her hands trembling as memories of the auction poured through her mind like poison. The laughter, the jeers, the cruel stares that had carved deep wounds into her soul. And though she was free from the stage, she was still trapped inside the belief that she was nothing more than the worthless image those voices had painted. A sob slipped through her lips before she could stop it, and once it began, she could no longer hold back. tears streaming as she buried her face in her hands, her voice breaking as she whispered that she was nothing, that saving her had been a waste, that she would only ever be a burden too heavy to carry. Jesse sat across the fire, his eyes fixed on her with a steady calm, his hat resting on the ground beside him, the flames throwing shadows across the scar that marked his jaw. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but strong, carrying the kind of truth that could not be broken. He told her she was wrong, that what those men had shouted was not the measure of her worth, that cruelty belonged to them, not her, and that her strength was greater than she could see because she had endured every humiliation and still stood, because her kindness survived in a world built on hardness, because her courage was proven in the simple act of holding on when death was at their heels. Each word cut through the lies she had believed for so long, and as he leaned forward, his eyes holding hers, he told her he had not saved her out of pity, nor because she was weak, but because what had been done to her was injustice, and he could not ride away from injustice without staining his own soul. For him, saving her was not charity, it was right, and no amount of gold could ever equal the worth of her spirit. Clara shook with silent sobs, her heart cracking open beneath the weight of his words, and slowly the chains of shame began to loosen, replaced by a fragile light she had almost forgotten existed. She looked at him through her tears, and saw not a drifter or a stranger, but a man who had seen past what others mocked and had chosen to believe in her when she could not believe in herself. The fire popped, sparks rising into the night sky like tiny stars, and for the first time in years, Clara felt as if those stars belonged to her too, when the first light of dawn spilled across the desert. Painting the horizon in fire and gold, Clara rose from the ashes of her pain with a strength she had never known, her shoulders no longer bent beneath the weight of shame, but lifted with the dignity of a woman reborn. And as Jesse tightened the saddle straps and met her gaze, she saw in his eyes not just the man who had freed her, but the truth that freedom itself had taken root inside her. Together they mounted the horse, the desert wind rushing to meet them, carrying away the last echoes of Dry Creek's cruelty, and every stride into the open land became a vow that no chain would ever bind her spirit again. The West would remember them, not as a drifter and a broken woman, but as a legend of courage and justice, whispered wherever firelight touched the night.